It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Omar Sadr. He's a research fellow at the Center for Governance and Markets in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. He just came with the Scholars Program after the US withdrawal, where he will lead the Afghanistan Project, and he's an assistant professor of political science at the American University of Afghanistan. I'm sure you all read his biography. He's written several articles, books, the last of which is Negotiating Cultural Diversity in Afghanistan, that was published in 2020. What I do want to say is that Professor Sadr brings to life the complex and nuanced texture of Afghanistan, the cultural diversity, the institutional arrangement, the political crossroads, the history, and the geopolitics. It is a much needed light in dark times. It is my big pleasure to introduce Professor Omar Sadr. Omar?
Thank you so much, Professor Mara. It's really a pleasure for me to be here amongst all of you. I'm looking forward to talking to you over 1 hour, I suppose, and engage with the audience afterwards.
So the audience was really excited. A lot of people wanted to have a conversation on Afghanistan, and I wouldn't like to focus only on the withdrawal, the recent withdrawal, but go a little, further, back in history. And I would be thankful if you could start by providing like an overview of, 2001, what happened then, when the Taliban left, and the constitutional process that ended in the Constitution of 2004, and what that meant, for Afghanistan then, and what happened later.
Right.
Big question.
Let me start with a broader picture about Afghanistan. Afghanistan as a modern state is roughly 140 years old. It was crafted and created as a result of intervention of two colonial powers in Central South Asia, namely the British and the US, before that, the Tsarist Russia. But Afghanistan at that point of time was one of the only independent states in Muslim nations, apart from Ottoman Empire. Of course, Ottoman Empire dissolved later on in around 24, but Afghanistan at that point of time was the only independent nation, and some of the core values which defined both the society and the state in Afghanistan deeply influenced the nature and dynamics of the state and society later on throughout the century. However, Afghanistan was able to build a constitution and a state to a large extent, and these efforts were indigenous. For example, the very first constitution of Afghanistan, which was enacted around very early 1923, that was an endeavor of multiple scholars which were from Afghanistan, but also a group of other experts coming from Ottoman Empire and the British India. So these scholars there was a network of people communicating between Kabul, Ottoman Empire, Central Asia, and British India. And that lively network led to such kind of collaboration, and which led to an emergence of a new constitution, very first constitution, which this constitution not only elaborated the structure of the state, but also outlined very fundamental rights of the people. So that's why this was very important step for Afghanistan. But now, if you move from 1923 to almost 100 years later on to the next century, Afghanistan, as you asked in 2000, what happened in 2001, it was struggling with a civil war. One of the parties of the civil war before 2001 was the current rulers of the Kabul, the Taliban. Primarily the Pashtun conservative militant movement, which were fighting again, the group which was fighting against them was primarily non-Pashtuns. But that civil war ended with the US intervention in 2001, and that which allowed Afghanistan to move back towards much more liberal state. But this process was deeply and heavily driven by international endeavors, including United States and many other Western allies. Be it, for example, crafting the constitution, or, for example, establishing many new institutions of the states. These were all a kind of international endeavor. What happened in 2004, some of the experts, but of course under influence of United States, they decided to revive the before war constitution of Afghanistan, which was 1964. So the constitution of 2004 was primarily written based on 1964 constitution. For example, fundamental rights of the citizens, the structure of the state, which is highly centralized, unitary system. This was all inspired by 1964 constitution. However, what's important for us, I think we are discussing issue of rights here, that the constitution of 2004 outlined and recognized a wide variety of fundamental rights of the citizens. And in that sense, it was much more progressive compared to the neighboring countries of Afghanistan. That, of course, Central Asian countries are very close, authoritarian, ruled by the leaders which are staying in the power since post-Soviet or the second generation of it. Iran is a theocratic state. China, you know better, it's a authoritarian state. So apart from India, Afghanistan was able to craft a very, very liberal set of rights. However, now the challenge remains for Afghanistan how to come into terms and how to resolve very, very deeply incommensurable set of values that existed in society. So Afghanistan is quite diverse society, be it in terms of culture, but also in terms of values, norms, beliefs of the people, and in terms of moral values. So I think the failure of Afghanistan in the last 20 years, since 2001, was in the lack of any kind of rational way to rationally resolve all these deeply contentious differences. Theoretically, there is, of course, a challenge here, because most of the liberals, the tradition of liberal thinking, aims to rationally resolve deeply contentious moral values in a society, but Afghanistan could not do it, and that's why state fall apart, and Taliban took over again in 15th of August.
There is so much to unpack in what you, Chap, said. I mean, there's no overlapping consensus. I forgot to introduce you as a fellow political theorist, and I'm glad you bring, those insights. So the Constitution of 2004 was really progressive, as you put it, and it brought all the set of liberal values and rights based on individuals, and it had a lot of impact on women in particular, where they could go out in public, live, study, get careers. That is one side of what the US intervention brought, but it's not the only kind of outcome. There was also a recognition of 14 ethnic groups, linguistic and cultural and different religions, but, minority rights haven't been defined in the Constitution, either. So that's create, one level of tension that I would like you to elaborate upon. And the other one, in terms of liberal rights now, is also, the individual rights of women. Let's start by this, if you could address this. And the last point, in this puzzle is that there is religious freedom, right? And this is one of the liberal tenets of the Constitution. but the president should be Muslim. So there is a tension right there. This happened in the Argentine constitution until 1944 as well. So de facto, Hindus and Buddhists are, prevented from enjoying fully their political rights.
Right. In terms of fundamental rights, theoretically, there is two debates. One is that we define rights as a set of, as a system of norms and rules which limit a state, right? Most of the liberal tradition is deeply interested on establishing this fundamental set of rules which block or make the power much more accountable. However, then emerging scholarship, which is kind of, for example, from Moody's Vivendi liberalism, they argue that human rights should be looked as a covenant of articles of peace, where individuals and communities with conflicting values and interests may consent to exist. Now, who will determine what set of norms or what set of rights are fundamental and what set of rights are not? For example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are so many rights which may not be fundamental, right? For example, I can refer to Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in most of the societies that's not practiced. It's about right to have a leave during employment with certain context. That's number one. Second, in Afghanistan also there was contention between individual rights and group rights. How while we ensure that individual rights are recognized and respected by the state, the state also cannot remain neutral when it comes to practices of culture. So whenever it takes a policy stance or a legislation, for example, with respect to so many cultural issues, of course, the state will remain biased in that sense. By endorsing a policy, of course, states takes a particular stance, and this stance may violate group rights. So in my book, I have talked about this contention between individual rights and group rights. For instance, how can we ensure people to practice their language? How can we ensure people, for example, to have equal access in terms of those, for example, people who come from marginalized communities, to have equal access to resources and state symbols and institutions do reflect as a mirror the entire group of peoples who are in Afghanistan. And in that sense, I think while Afghanistan had a kind of much more progress in terms of recognition of individual rights in law, but when it comes to recognition of group rights, there were so many issues that some of them you referred to. Yes, of course, first of all, the constitutions highlighted 4 different ethno-national groups and acknowledged them in Article 16. However, when it comes to, for example, official language, national language, the language which are, for example, a national anthem, these are symbolic, but these are quite important in a deeply divided, fragmented society. So there were so many issues that the state could not acknowledge that. Also the fact that the constitution mentioned that only the president should be Muslim. So this, by default, deprived the non-Muslim minorities of Afghanistan from this political participation at this level. So that was the second contention. The third contention, of course, Afghanistan being at the societal level, a traditional society. So the issue of women's rights, what will be the limits on women's rights? How do we define these rights and liberties for women? So of course, there should be certain kind of conversation between society and the elites who are crafting the constitution in order to come to a common ground on this. And I think that remained contentious for the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And where now you have the Taliban coming back and rolling back all those rights when it comes to women. That doesn't suggest that society in Afghanistan does not respect very fundamental rights for women. because of the simple fact that the Taliban took over as not by consent. They enforce certain vision of morality and what is good for society by force rather than by consent. So I think this challenge is not limited to Afghanistan. Most of the Muslim countries still struggle across these three issues that I highlighted. How do we define women's rights? How can we have a consensus when it comes to this dynamics between collective rights and individual rights, but also about some sort of universal moral values and local values. How can we negotiate all of them?
Yeah, those are three great dimensions. And I wanted to mention that in the context of, state building, because this fragmentation, it seems that Afghanistan, and correct me, if I'm wrong, had a history of imperial intervention, right, as early as ever, but I can cite 1839 with the East India Company, where they actually put, in place, I think it was the great-great-great-grandfather of Karzai, if I'm correct, and the British were basically expelled. But even with this imperial intervention, Afghanistan hasn't succeeded in developing like a civic dimension, right? State building and a civic dimension in which all these different groups identify besides the expelling the foreigner. So there's a tension there, in this dynamic that, of course, there's the foreigner comes, it seems to, try to mediate among groups, but the groups realize, they expel, but then it is fragmented. And this is when the Taliban, is seen as a possible outcome. Is that a reading that you would do?
Well, in terms of international intervention, throughout last 200 years, let's say, Afghanistan realized three superpowers intervening. The first one was Britishers, which throughout 19th century, there were three major wars called Anglo-Afghanistan wars took place. Then came Soviet, and finally it was the Americans. The very first one, the Britishers didn't aim for modernization of Afghanistan. They didn't come to revolutionary change the society, inject new values, introduce people with a set of norms and rights. That was not the core objective of Britishers. Britishers were much more interested in geopolitics, and they wanted to establish Afghanistan as a buffer in order to secure British India. So that's why they were not much interested in investing in Afghanistan and occupying it for a long period of time. They knew that it's quite costly, and Afghanistan didn't have much in return to provide to Britishers. But when it comes to Soviet, yes, Soviet first came as one of the major development partners for Afghanistan in 1950s, but later on the intervention took place in 79, and then with that, Soviets drastically, and I think deeply, aimed to revolutionize the society and transform the society and inject certain modern values and norms. Of course, that was from a left perspective, but in terms of elevating women's rights, the Soviet intervention was crucial, very, very crucial. Women's rights we had a certain progress in that era with respect to rights of minorities and recognition of them. Soviets were very, very, the Soviet-backed state in Afghanistan, they took quite crucial steps. It was for the first time the Soviet-backed state in Afghanistan which acknowledged the injustices done to as many marginalized communities or non-Pashtuns. And the state tried to take certain steps in order to acknowledge that and probably in some cases compensate the marginalized communities.
What was that in order to undermine the Pashtun power? Let me, if I can bring, one point that the Pashtuns are seen as the majority, and they kind of gathered the cultural values that they expand to kind of Afghanistan. It's the flag and it's the language. But there are other groups, and you dispute, the term minorities, because minority is a relation of power as opposed to a numerical point, right? The Tajiks, the Kyrgyz, the Hazaras, etc. So was the Soviet intervention a way, like recognizing minorities, a way to control power, undermine Pashtun power?
Not exactly, because if you look at the broader regional policy of the Soviets adopted a pro-Pashtunistan policy, which was Pashtunistan is a kind of irredentist claim of Afghanistan over certain territories in Pakistan, wherein you have Pashtuns on both sides of the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So Pashtun rulers in Afghanistan always had an issue with this, and the Soviets endorsed that policy. So that the major regional policy was in favor of Pashtuns. But when it comes to nationality issues, Soviets followed the same policy that they did in Central Asia. And that was the thesis which was presented by Stalin, which was recognition of equal nationalities in the Soviets. So even in Central Asia, you had Tajiks, you had Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, and others. The same was brought in Afghanistan, and a particular ministry was established, which was Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and the ministry was mandated to support, elevate those marginalized communities. So this was not necessarily anti-Pashtun, but of course, when it comes to regional dynamics of power, that gradually and slowly undermined Pashtun in that hierarchy of the power that they existed. But also the third factor is the non-Pashtun president during the Soviets. The third president of Afghanistan of the Soviet invasion was Babrak Karmal, and he is a Persian-speaking Tajik. And the party which also ruled during the Soviets intervention in the major era was Parcham, which was primarily urbanized Persian-speaking elites, primarily Tajiks and Hazaras. So in that sense, Soviet invasion and 14 years rule of the left party was quite instrumental in replacing that dynamics of power between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns, because it was this era that non-Pashtuns' percentage and participation in government and in institutions increased to a large extent. Now, the issue of who is minority, who is majority is quite controversial in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan never had a segregated statistical data about its population. And the main reason is not in the lack of capacity. Now, of course, different governments had the capacity to conduct a survey, but the issue was that traditional rulers of Afghanistan, they never wanted to have a segregated data to indicate which ethnic group is what percentage, because that will automatically undermine the myth of the Pashtun majority. The Pashtun majority is not based on certain data, but it's a myth which was constructed throughout the history. So that myth will be deconstructed. So that's why I prefer, instead of the terms majority and minority, which is quite problematic, we use the term group rights, which does not, for example, put certain group at an advantage position and the others in a disadvantaged position, but rather it will provide an equal recognition for everyone.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It reminds me of Lebanon. In Lebanon, the same thing happens. They're prevailing census because they would know, the composition of the population. But this point that you make about minorities, is key not only for Afghanistan, but illuminates dynamics, for example, that are taking place in the US as well, where you call minorities groups that are definitely not minorities and that will soon be actual majorities. I want to go back to the kind of historical line. I didn't know about the tribal ministry. That's fascinating for me. So then there is the Taliban. The Taliban is a reaction because they're Pashtun, and there's a reaction to the Soviets. And after that, we have like the US intervention. If you can continue with the line, because the US had, major say in the way that the constitution was crafted, not only in terms of individual rights, but also something that is not usually highlighted, that is the institutional arrangement, right, and the institutional design of a constitution, which may favor centralization, power sharing, and this, has consequences, implications, different implications for different groups.
Right. So even before this 2004 constitution, so Afghanistan throughout the history of 140 years, it was ruled from Kabul. It was heavily centralized state. Decentralization you can observe either administratively or fiscally or politically. For example, the governors in provinces were never accountable politically to the people of the province. Rather, they were appointed by Kabul and they were accountable to the president. And president always had this discretionary power to remove them or appoint someone else. Fiscally, for instance, the local administration didn't have any authority or capacity to generate revenue from their own respective local administration or have the capacity to spend. And same was with administration, So this led to a deep kind of divide between state institutions, be it at the local level or central level, and the people, because people could not connect with the state. Now, 2004 constitution also repeat the same things. And one of the main logics that those who are in favor of a centralized administration put forward was that, well, Afghanistan just came out of a civil war. And of course, there are many, many militia groups and warlords who have vested interests. And if we move on and, for example, allow Afghanistan to have a decentralized or even federal structure, that might lead to disintegration of the state. So that's why a decentralized structure or a federal structure was presented as a national security threat. And gradually it became a taboo to speak about a decentralized structure or a federal state. However, geographically, culturally, demographically, Afghanistan did not suit a centralized unitary state structure because people are divided in different cultural zones. In terms of geography, Afghanistan is it has a very difficult terrain and you cannot connect one port to another port easily. So what happened, this system could not respond to the realities on the ground, to the demand and the rights of the people. And hence, Taliban used such kind of opportunity or misused this opportunity because there was an increasing kind of contention amongst communities that the state is not responding to them and cannot meet, for example, some of the basic fundamental needs in terms of services, be it education or health, but also in terms of legitimacy. So look at here, legitimacy is not just something about empirical to what extent, what percentage of people are in favor of a state and 1% or not, but it's somehow normative, where you have that sense of ownership of the state. So majority of the people, primarily non-Pashtuns, got alienated gradually from the state, do not perceive the state as their own, because either its symbols or the way power was designed and shared, it could not allow the non-Pashtuns participation. So the state gradually became weakened, and that the link which should have established between people and the society as in an organic manner, that could not come forward. So that was one of the key fundamental reasons of the state failure that in the last 20 years. And instead of establishing state institutions and working on the legitimacy of a state from the angle of how people perceive it and to what extent that state institutions allow public participation, state legitimacy was perceived through liberal norms, as it was injected by the Western community. So I think there was incompatibility between these norms, which was enforced by the Western allies, and the demands of the people. And this led to weakening of the state.
Yeah, because what is Sobrina, because what you're saying, if I'm understanding, correctly, is like you need this civic dimension in order to actually, strengthen the state, and a state that responds to the people, to strengthen this civic dimension in the context of fragmentation in culture. And this is, the ignorance that the Western powers continue to bring. They only focus on individual rights, ignoring this dimension that, in the end failed. There was a missed opportunity, right, to support like an organic, as you mentioned, grassroots from the cultures up to the state in order to build this state. And this is when, the Taliban, against, the failure of the occupation, gain more support. I mean, maybe unwillingly, right? And mostly in rural areas, but still.
Yeah, exactly. So that I think the way that we define a democratic government is important. I'm not suggesting here that majority of people in Afghanistan do not endorse these modern values, rights, and democratic system of government, but it's the way that we enact them and the way that we present it. For the literature that I cited earlier, Modus Vivendi, one of the key philosophers, John Gray, he says that democratic government is not an expression of universal rights, for instance, national self-determination, if you see, but it is a sort of necessity enabling disparate communities to reach to a common decision. And there should be ways to remove government without violence. That's how we should understand democratic government, right? So in Afghanistan, this didn't happen. A state was not considered or observed as an institution which enables different communities to reach to a common decision, or the communities should have possibilities to change system of government or modes of governance. For example, there was a strong push by the Persian speakers, and particularly Tajiks and Hazaras, to create a decentralized state. But in 20 years, such kind of normal reform could not take place. So it was so much difficult for a state to observe reforms and to remain flexible to reforms, right? So this, of course, leads to this contention. So now, the tribal revolt of the Taliban in South is is complex because it has certain roots in the system of governance. It also had certain roots in the contentious nature of the values and norms, but at the same time, there was also many other factors, including the way United States intervened in Afghanistan, the way, for example, the Taliban leaders in 2001, they were imprisoned without a due process of law. They were tortured in Guantanamo Bay and some other prisons in Afghanistan, for example, Bagram. But also the way, for example, Pakistan provided infrastructure for a very radical militant movement in terms of, for example, sanctuaries, financial support, madrasa systems, the network of madrasas. So these all give hand to hand together in order to enable this radical militant movement to challenge the state. But I think if we put aside these geopolitical factors and the way Pakistan intervened or United States intervened, one of the core issues which led to failure of the system in Afghanistan was that, and time and again I want to emphasize on this, is the way Afghanistan could not reconcile different incompatible or incommensurable values. The way that there should have been a sort of common understanding. Of course, in this Western societies, it's impossible to reach to a consensus. on such kind of incommensurable values. How do you expect a deeply divided war-torn country like Afghanistan to come to a consensus? Consensus is usually quite challenging and tough. Now, the way out and solution is building up certain institutions to allow different communities with different set of values to come together and have that set of ownership. So, I mean, building institutions can neutralize this contention. And that institution is, of course, a decentralized structure, a federal system, rather than a highly centralized one.
Because yes, there seems to be a paradox, because you need institutions, you know, to make it work, but you need the people to come together and build those institutions, and it goes back and forth until, you know, practice are internalized and settle. And again, I go to, that was the big missed opportunity, you know, of the US, as opposed to just focusing on individual rights and a centralized system, because a centralized system favors the Pashtuns, right? Some big groups in Afghanistan, like Tajiks, favor like some sort of power sharing, and smaller groups, just to, you know, lay it out for the audience, like some smaller groups want more local autonomy. Right. So this is not only about democracy, because you can have democracy in a centralized state, in a power sharing, or a decentralized, but the model of democracy that's going to be more conducive, you know, to sustain democracy. And there hasn't been advance, you know, in these respects.
Right. So model of democracy, I think we, to a large extent, we take for granted democracy, and we assume that there is a standard model of democracy which works everywhere, right? So that eventually neglects local nuances, local demands, and local necessities. I mean, we should be much more responsive to what is happening in a certain context. So a democratic system should be flexible enough to respond to the demands of the people. It's of course, we can never give a judgment that a centralized Republican system is not a democracy. A centralized system might have given positive response in many other countries. But what happens in a context which is coming out of civil war, it is quite multicultural, it has deeply contentious issue with several norms, be it local, be it regional, be it universal. So how do we come up with a solution? So I think balancing different needs and demands is quite important. One was the balance should be between demand for unity. Of course, no one wanted Afghanistan to disintegrate. So unity was quite important, but at the same time, the other primary demand is also diversity. So how do we balance between unity and diversity? Now, you have multiple responses to them. You have liberals and nationalists in Afghanistan, primarily Pashtun ethno-nationalists. Their solution is quite assimilationist one, pushing for a very centralized, I mean, in terms of a structure, a centralized system, but in terms of cultural policies, a quite assimilationist model of the state, which aims to establish an homogeneous national character, not based on consensus and inclusion of everyone, but based on exclusionary model of culture, norm, and identity of one ethnic group. On the other hand, you have also the others which emphasize much on diversity and neglect unity, right? And this is risky for modern states, that this may lead sometimes to fragmentation of the states. For example, the Balkan states, that they could not establish this balance between acknowledging diversity, respecting that cultural diversity, but at the same time unity. So in middle ground, you have many other traditions. And if I may speak in some philosophical terms and theoretical terms, you have, in liberalism, we have two different branches. One is proceduralist. Proceduralists are the ones which come from tradition of Thomas Hobbes, wherein they emphasize on a minimalist state, that state according to them, as an institution which is only responsible for establishing law and order, and that it should not take any kind of value judgment or moral standpoint because it will become biased. So in modern literature, for example, Michael Oakeshott has taken this stance, or literature which is coming from John Gray is taking this stance. But at the same time, you have another branch of liberals, for example, John Rawls, be it egalitarians or libertarians, both of them, they're coming under this category of civic assimilationists, wherein they talk about this dynamic of unity and diversity, and they say that a state should be able to forge certain form of consensus when it comes to common culture. A state is not just there to a set of institutions to establish rule of law, but also it should create certain consensus when it comes to common culture and leaving the private sphere for individuals. So I think both of these are somehow problematic. Be it the first one because states cannot remain neutral, as Michael Oakeshott and John Gray and many others suggest, or also the one which says that a state should forge certain national consensus, because this neglects that cultural diversity and group rights of the people. Mm-hmm. A middle ground is the one which is a multicultural state.
Yeah, those are great points, and I'm glad you bring this theoretical discussion, and to bring it down to one example. There was a huge debate around identity cards, right? In Afghanistan, and the identity card, it was first going to say Afghan, which is like a euphemism for Pashtun, right? Even though we, outside Afghanistan, we assume that Afghanistan is a shared identity. It's actually has already built in, it's not neutral, right? It has a built-in content, cultural content, I mean. And the whole issue of the identity cards were like, groups were pushing to actually have the particular ethnicity as well placed on the identity card. And these came to be written finally in the law. But then Karzai, if I understand correctly, and Ghani did not ratify the law. So this exemplifies, in a way, this tension that you're mentioning. What was the importance of that law?
Well, the issue of national identity now in a multicultural society is always something which is quite challenging in order to reach to a consensus. Imagine a state which pushes for assimilation for over 100 years. And this assimilation policy is driven by coming from a certain cultural baggage. It doesn't come from a neutral standpoint. This leads to a sense of alienation amongst the rest of the communities, right? During the Soviet era, of course, the Soviets policy allowed certain form of recognition for a kind of multiple identities. But when it came for post-2001, this issue was renegotiated. This came up for the first time in the Constitutional Assembly, which was crafting the Constitution. So there were two different multiple demands. One was that Afghanistan should be imagined and should be defined by this term Afghan, which is a very recent identity, a modern name for the country. But another, I think, segment of the representatives, which were primarily non-Pashtuns, they challenged this identity and said this is not inclusive enough to represent the rest. And instead, they tried to draw back from much more medieval history, the terms, connotations, cultures, and history from back in order to redefine or reimagine Afghanistan. Now, the issue of how a state should recognize many cultures or ethno-national identities, right? It's not easy, because once a state, according to me, once a state opened this Pandora box of recognizing identities, it will not stop in 1, 2, or for example, a list of 20 ethnic groups, because there will be continuously demand from society for more recognition. Recognition is one of the central demands of human beings. Based on Hegelian theory, you have the three things, which is desire, one, rationality, and urge for recognition. So recognition gives us dignity. Recognition, if you satisfy certain, as a human being, if you satisfy your certain standards and norms, that gives you dignity. But if those issues are violated, that leads to humiliation and shame. So that's why recognition is quite central. But now the politics of recognition in a divided society is quite challenging, because like the case of Afghanistan, the term Afghan was challenged, but then the suggestion was to give recognition to every single ethnic group. But now, how do you define the boundaries of ethnic groups? Because the way you define ethnic groups based on practices, culture, history, that may lead to certain form of segregation, which may not allow common history, which multiple ethnic groups share with each other throughout history, emerge. For example, let's say about Tajiks and Hazaras. They are different ethnic groups, but they share language, which is Persians speaking. Or let's say Pashtuns and Tajiks. They speak different languages, but they share religious sect, right? So recognition, which comes from such kind of communitarian perspective, assumes ethnic groups in a predefined category, which is not changeable, right? But at the same time opens a very contentious way out, wherein for example, every 5 or 6 years, you will have a new demand for a recognition. So what is the way out for a multicultural society? What is the way out in order to not have a very exclusionary, ethnocentric national identity like the term Afghan, but at the same time do not open another controversial way wherein there would be continuous debate. So my stance in the book was that, well, the state should remain in that sense, acknowledge both of them. But in the national identity cards, there was no need to mention either the term Afghan or the name of ethnic groups. That was the only way to forge a consensus between everyone, to not go for one of these ways, for an exclusionary identity, but also for the identities which were controversial.
Yeah, that's because this builds civic identity, you know, a commonality, even at the minimum denominator, but still a commonality. I want to move, you know, to women's rights, and there's so much to cover. And then what happens with all of these issues that we are discussing, you know, in the current context of Afghanistan, with the withdrawal, you know, of the US, in the way the US withdrew, you know, the jumping in, you know, of China on copper as an economic power, and in the midst of an economic and humanitarian, you know, crisis, extended poverty, deadliest place, you know, for women, you know, and children. So first women's rights, and then where are we now in Afghanistan, and what your reading of the situation is?
Well, so I think one of the key terms which can characterize Afghanistan is the term kind of totalitarian order at the moment. A totalitarian order is not necessarily defined vis-a-vis a liberal democracy. Rather, a totalitarian order is defined as a system which systematically suppresses and undermines civil society. Now, Taliban are doing the same thing when it comes to women, for example. Women groups and women activists who have been standing in the last 5 months to reclaim their rights, to be recognized, have been brutally suppressed by the Taliban. I think women were the forefront of any kind of claim for the rights in the last 5 months. They were abducted illegally by the Taliban. They were imprisoned, and not in formal state prisons, but in informal houses. In most of the cases, unfortunately, there were reports that they were raped. So the Taliban, unlike what was in last 3 years since the time negotiations were going on, that there was an effort to rebrand them as a moderate group, which is willing to accommodate now different demands, including the rights demands for women and minorities. Now, however, what happened since 15th of August that the state collapsed in Afghanistan and Taliban took over, Taliban did not respect any such kind of diversity and rights for individuals, including the women's rights. So at this moment, of course, there is a humanitarian catastrophe because the banking system collapsed. People doesn't have enough access to cash. There's no liquidity. And the United States also froze the assets of Afghanistan, which is roughly around $10 billion. And that sort of sanctions also impacted badly the economy and finance of Afghanistan. But apart from all of this, the other aspect, apart from humanitarian catastrophe, the other aspect is that Afghanistan, unfortunately, loses its vibrant civil society. And this is because Taliban brutally suppress any voice which dissents from the norms, values, and standards, Sharia-driven system that Taliban proposes. And this is a clear indicator of a totalitarian system. A totalitarian system, be it, you have the classical examples, all of them, were the one which doesn't have civil society, right? So associations, gatherings, political parties, let's say, free media, right? Women's rights to participate, either in education or in free media or in work. These were all challenged. But what happened? The woman came with very short but very meaningful demand. There were 3 main slogans in the woman movement in the last 5 months. Non-Karaza, these are the Persian words, means food, work, and freedom. So they challenged this theocratic state that most of the Taliban rulers says, well, we came and we did jihad, and now it is not responsibility of the state to find out work, employment, or to feed the people. Now, women hold these guys accountable. Well, if you claim that you are in a state, you should behave responsibly, and you are accountable to the people, provide employment opportunities, because women were kicked out of public spaces. So their demand was for right to employment. Demand was for right to food, because most of the women who were deprived of the employment, they cannot earn, they cannot feed their family. But most importantly, liberty and freedom, which was the central claim of this movement, woman movement now. Now, how they define it, because I have been in touch with women, it is both defined in a limited manner, a negative liberty, but also positive liberty. And in the sense, negative liberty, women do claim that the state and society does not have any right to intervene and limit my choices. So that's my freedom, whatever I have to choose. And the state should not limit it, for example, the way of clothing or hijab or burqa that is imposed on women. That is an interference of the state on the individual choices. But at the same time, they also claim for a positive right, which is holding the state accountable, that states should enable individuals or provide that conducive environment for them so that individuals could enjoy their rights, could practice their rights, right? So Taliban has limited that conducive environment. So that's why liberties are in danger.
Yes, this goes to the difference that Isaiah Berlin makes between negative freedom and positive freedom. One is freedom from, as you were saying, the intervention of the state, and the other one is freedom for. And in that case, it's freedom for providing the conditions for food and work. And actually, if you only focus on work, it would be food, because, women without work, as you said, they can't feed their families. And the International Rescue Committee wrote a report about how they are the least fed in this because they favor their kids before they're just suffering malnutrition. So what is the way, what do you see the way out, if so, and what is the role of external powers, including the international court, the criminal court, in terms of pressuring? And also I encourage the audience to start submitting questions.
Way out is, number one, we need to acknowledge the fact that the Taliban does not represent the entire diverse people of Afghanistan. They are one segment. Unfortunately, what we heard in the last 5 months, that it is repetitively said that Taliban is a reality of Afghanistan. They are not reality of Afghanistan. They are reality of one segment of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is quite diverse. Second, the way Taliban took over by force in 15th August, that somehow ruled out all political ways to settle this dispute. Afghanistan does require a political roadmap in order to settle this conflict. A military takeover of the Taliban will be challenged by others, just because of the fact that they suppress civil society, they suppress liberties. If they were just authoritarian like any other states, you might have said, oh, well, there are numerous states ruled by authoritarianism. So what is the problem? Because international community has so many other challenges. And of course, Afghanistan may not be priority for many, but the case is different here. Taliban suppress civil society, and their aim is to establish a totalitarian state. Whether international community like it or not, people will stand against them, either by civil way, like the women of Afghanistan, primarily in Kabul and northern provinces, to claim back their rights, or by militant violent means, right? So that's why, in order to avoid this catastrophe, we do need to have a political roadmap to reach to a settlement, political settlement. And in this, international community has a role, because they should facilitate and force Taliban to not take things for granted, but also acknowledge many other political parties, sit with them together and reach to a settlement. Now, what sort of settlement? And that two things are required. Number one, as we discussed throughout this 1 hour, Afghanistan does require a decentralized structure to accommodate non-Pashtuns' demand for rights, recognition, and power. They need to be equally, they deserve equal treatment in terms of recognition, in terms of dignity, and in terms of political participation. And only a federal structure will accommodate this demand, number one. Secondly, we need to reach to a minimal set of rights, an agreement on a minimal set of rights. The Taliban and others, the rest, because it's a minimal set of rights which ensures security for individuals, which protects individuals against any kind of intervention, intrusion, which society or those who are in power may do, right? Now, Taliban does not recognize even a short list of 5 rights that you say, right to life, right to, for example, liberty, food, employment. These things we need to reach. Of course, set of fundamental rights might be very challenging in a deeply divided society to come to an agreement, but we don't have any other way except to minimally, we have to give concessions to this militant radical movements of Taliban. Of course, without concessions to them, we may not be able to reach a consensus, but at the same time, Taliban should also acknowledge this fact that they cannot expropriate everyone's rights unilaterally. They don't have this right to do that, deprive everyone else from that right. So that's why any kind of settlement in Afghanistan requires these 2 main elements. One is decentralized institutions. Second is an agreement on a minimal set of human rights in order to protect individuals. And I would thought,
because that would secure, both. It would make sure that you have rights for women, because only if you recognize the right to work you are already recognizing the right of women to go out in the public sphere, which is taken for granted in many societies, but it's not to be taken for granted. And two, in terms of federalism, you would give, claims of symbolic recognition and political power sharing for these diverse groups. So it would attend both. I encourage questions. If not, I have, more questions, and I ask you, Omar, if you want to address, any other issue. But what I would ask is that whether in your sense, like, was the cost of the failure of the US, like, pay the cost, the feminism was the cost, like a feminist movement was the cost?
The cost of this failure was, I think, yes, of course, you're right, one was that, but it also inflicted a huge cost on the common people of Afghanistan, those who are now suffering and they don't have access to basic livelihood. They don't have access to food. Over 20 million, this will be the biggest humanitarian catastrophe of our age. Or over 20 million people, based on the statistics that United Nations has given, don't have access to minimal food to eat, right? So that's number one. Apart from that, fragmentation of state institutions. For 20 years, we invested, and Afghanistan had a vibrant state institutions. It also, we generated a younger generation, which were contributing in different sense, be it as a technocrats in the state, or be it as a university in different capacities, but also in civil society. But now most of that capacity is out of the country. A huge exodus of people of Afghanistan is taking place. Those who knew something, now they cannot live in Afghanistan because there's no livelihood there. There's no employment opportunities. So they're either there or there's fear of persecution by the Taliban. So they don't have any choice except to leave the country. And this is a huge cost. Afghanistan cannot recover this human resources, capital, which once leave the Afghanistan. Many of them may not return back to the country, right? So that is the second one. Of course, and third one is the women's rights, human rights in general. So now the Taliban does not respect minimum things. Of course, they have deceived the international community. And many will say, well, let's be moderate. Let's take our expectations or make our expectations in a very moderate manner, because Afghanistan is not Europe. But that doesn't mean that we deprive every single individual in Afghanistan from their fundamental rights. Of course, Taliban has changed from 90s, 96 to 2000. But that change, as they might accept certain things, but they have also become much more brutal. Now they are much more capable how to use state institutions as an instrument to suppress the state, right? The way, for example, now they abduct women, they suppress freedom of press, freedom of expression, and media and association. That somehow you can't even find examples of this, the way that they do it, brutalize people in the history of Afghanistan. So the Taliban of today is much more brutal compared to Taliban of 90s.
Why do you think that's the case? I mean, the Taliban was also underestimated. I mean, it has transnational, connections, and it's the transnational movement. So, that came back to Afghanistan. But why do you think it's more brutal than ever? Because the reaction of the invader, because it's kind of an existential framing of the conflict, right? The incompatible, as you were mentioning before, sets of values. Why do you think that that's the case?
Yes, you're right. One is that, but also the way this political Islam as an ideology was transformed in the last 3 decades in South Asia. So Taliban come from this Deobandi school of thought, which is primarily now housed in Pakistan, and most of the madrasas and near to the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan and the central one is the Gurahatek, which is administered by the militant political parties, Jamiat Ulama Islam and Jamaat Islami, the two Sunni Deobandi political parties of Pakistan. Now, before 1980s, they followed only the indigenous conservative brand of Islam, which was Deobandi. But with jihad against Soviet Union, many wealthy Arabs also joined this movement. And from 90s onwards, these Taliban militants got exposure with Arab militants, who brought with themselves a new variant of Islam, which was Wahhabi Islam of the Arabian model. So now you have a fusion of traditional Deobandi, but also some elements of Wahhabi movement together. So that's why quite a strange form of transformation of this ideology led to much more radicalization of this movement. Secondly, also the way that you characterize it in an existential manner, the boundaries were created between West and the West, and the rest was primarily the political Islam. So this dualism between what Islam is and how it should be defined, and always it was defined in a very antagonistic manner against the Western values or modern values represented by the West. That left quite a short kind of a scope for us for a kind of dialogue between these values and mutual understanding of these values. So that also led to such kind of very radicalization. So it is, I think, it's a crisis in Islamic civilization, an internal crisis of Islamic civilization, that how Muslims, they should come into terms with the radical movements like this, that they challenge the modern values. Now, they do not challenge, in certain cases like Taliban, the international state system or the Westphalian system, because they instrumentally expropriate state and their own benefits. Mm-hmm. But they are heavily against two things. They are heavily against civil society, number one, and then a fundamental set of rights. They aim to redefine the rights based on their own reading of Sharia, but they, at the same time, they do not allow civil society at all.
Yeah, that's an excellent one. It made me think while you were talking that this radicalization, of Islam, that you can have an analogy here, in the US, there's also a radicalization of religion in the way, it reads what rights should be rights for everybody, right? In terms of, for example, abortion among the most important one, because that also goes against, the rights of individuals, and a particular, reading of religion that is not, shared by all Christians, right? Mm-hmm. It made me think about these movements that are taking place, in the world. Is there anything else that you want to cover that I haven't covered, because people are feeling shy today in terms of questions?
Well, I think that's all from my side. We spoke about quite different things, from women's rights to the institutional designs and arrangements in Afghanistan, to the issue of values and norms.
So let me ask you a last question. How can people outside of Afghanistan support Afghanistan, help this process, besides being interested in this process? Are there any particular organizations? Are there any particular ways?
Well, I think the immediate need of Afghanistan is addressing this humanitarian catastrophe, which is happening. People doesn't have access to basic livelihood. It's not that people are begging. What happened as a result of the sanctions and military takeover of the Taliban, even a small and medium level businesses fall apart, because banking system was frozen and they could not have access to their assets. So many who were working and they had a good livelihood, they lost their jobs, and then now they are desperate to what to do. we cannot address this by small immediate steps. Of course, a small immediate support is needed in order to prevent a catastrophe in this winter, but we need to address it in a structural manner. Afghanistan, despite the fact that now it's ruled by the Taliban, and many of us are against the Taliban and the way they treat people, I think it should have a viable and very enabling system of banking. Market should be revived, and there are ways to support people without endorsing or supporting the Taliban. And it is not that we don't have any other solution. We don't have any solution at all. There are solutions, but probably challenging. So I think we need to differentiate between Taliban on one hand and Afghanistan on the other hand, and the people of Afghanistan who need immediate. And this humanitarian catastrophe could not be addressed until and unless we do not have a functioning financial system in the country. And of course, because the Taliban are the ruler, they need to ensure international community that they will not misuse the aid which is flowing to Afghanistan for their own militants. But there have been so many reports that Taliban are misusing the humanitarian aid for their own purpose. Second is international community, as I mentioned again earlier, we do need to acknowledge that Afghanistan requires a decentralized federal governance to accommodate demands of non-Pashtuns and non-Taliban. Without that, Afghanistan will go to this vicious cycle of war, violence, and violence time and again.
Are there any organizations that you recommend to support? Because I know a lot of people in the audience, those who are here today and those who will, check the event, later. Are there organizations that you vet to send money? I remember when, there was the explosion in Beirut, and, I have lived in Beirut, so I knew that certain organizations looked iffy and the money would be funneled somewhere else. And there are organizations that actually get the money to the people. If you can recommend a few and share them with me for me to share to the audience.
Okay.
Are there any organizations that you would like to mention, if you know of?
I don't have immediate names with me now, but definitely there are many now organizations who try to reach out and raise funds globally to support people. I can share a list of these after our talk, and you can share it with the audience.
Yeah, that would be great. And I want to say that you came here after the Taliban took over in the scholars program. So you are one of those who were there to build a state but had to leave. Do you want to say anything about this program? Are you planning, to stay here, envisioning to go back at some point?
Yes, I think a Scholar Rescue Fund is it exemplifies this sense of solidarity in academia that many scholars, not only in Afghanistan but other conflict regions like Syria or Iraq, who didn't have that freedom of expression or academic freedom in their own countries, they were forced to leave the country. So a Scholar Rescue Fund provides this fabulous opportunity for them to not only find a placement, but also an opportunity to continue their career. Because if you are an academic person who lives in a conflict zone, if you leave your academia, it's quite challenging to find your way back, right? So having your career is quite important. And I think the values and norms that Scholars Rescue Fund is built on, I think academic solidarity, that's quite important for us at this very difficult time, which gives this sharing the good with the rest. And I think we are thankful to Scholars Rescue Fund, but there are many other organizations also in North America and in Europe and in Asia, which covers scholars. For many years, for example, Iranians were under persecution. Conflict in Yemen, conflict in Iraq and Syria. and many other authoritarian states has forced scholars or free thinkers to leave their countries. And leaving the country is not an easy job. It's not an option. You literally leave. For example, in case of me, I left my home in a matter of few hours, and I didn't have even an opportunity to properly think how to leave the country. So it was as rash as that. So, and leaving a place that you have built for 30 years, a place that you call home, a place that where you have sense of belonging to it. It's not a choice. It's quite difficult circumstances.
Yes, I hear you. And at the same time, we have the luxury after all that hurdle and that wrenching exit, because you not only leave the place, but you leave your history, your language, the smells, you know, the colors. But we have the luxury to, you know, to hear your voice and the texture and complex, you know, picture that you give about Afghanistan that is not usually heard outside, you know, certain circles. So I thank you very, very, very much for all of this. It was a real treat. And I thank the audience and the team, and I hope we stay in touch, and I look forward to hearing from you with those sources to share from the audience, Omar.
Thank you. No, the real pleasure was mine. It was a good conversation with you, and I'm really happy that you provided this opportunity for me to share what I wrote and what I thought.
Thank you so much, Omar. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sadr and Professor Kolesas. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good weekend.